Hello and welcome to the Systematic Review-lution. My name is Katja. I'm with the University of Amsterdam and my co-author is Katie Seaborn with Tokyo Tech. This is a manifesto to promote both rigor and inclusivity in research synthesis. This is a representation of what it feels like to be in HCI right now. We're inundated with papers and trying to find specific answers or getting a full picture of research on a specific subtopic feels like a laborious, if not even impossible task. If we search for human-computer interaction in the ACM Digital Library, we get a lot of results, almost 660,000 of them, in fact. And you can see that there's been a steep increase, from 8,500 in the year 2000 alone to 27,000 in a year just 10 years later, and then 35,000 in 2020. Last year alone, 37,000 papers were published with this keyword. This flood of papers makes questions about synthesis even more pressing. Research synthesis is summarizing and critically reflecting on primary research to form a meta-level understanding. The goal being usually to form or arrive at a clear big picture, a map of the field, statistical estimation of a true effect, robust answers to specific research questions, and clear guidelines and implications for future research and design, as well as future directions for research. One example of research synthesis is the systematic review, but there are, of course, also other forms of synthesis. Systematic reviews are not clearly defined. In fact, definitions thereof are often vague and ambiguous, and often using terms such as clear, explicit, and systematic without further elaboration, without making clear what is meant by systematic. Given this, and given the steep increase in papers being published in HCI, this raises important questions. How can we synthesize the literature at this size and growing at this pace? How can we support new ideas in shaking up the field to avoid stagnation and ossification, as described by Chu and Evans? How can we create robust knowledge in addition to novelty? How can we synthesize all the types of research housed within HCI? We see the need for a community-driven conversation to support research synthesis from both sides. So number one, how can we package our work, our primary research work, in a way that meaningful research synthesis can later be practiced on it? And then, what should research synthesis actually look like when it is grounded in this kind of plurality and different types of work? HCI already features a lot of different types of synthesis. We have systematic reviews, although they often show a wide array of understandings of what that might entail. We have meta-analyses, although often this involves no statistical synthesis, even though where the term originated, that would have been required. So in HCI, meta here is more, it's about papers. We have surveys, we have scoping reviews, we have overviews, but for all of these, it's not exactly clear-cut how each of them should be conducted. On top of that, we need to touch on some objections to research synthesis. These are some concerns that are voiced within HCI about research synthesis in general. So, for example, will no one read and cite the primary research papers anymore if we have more and more of this secondary research? We don't think so. We think synthesis papers can coexist next to primary research papers, but it's absolutely worth considering citation politics as more synthesis is produced. Further, will the synthesized results enforce a Procrustean norm that ignores the variations within the primary research papers? Yes, it probably could. But sometimes we think that capturing those beautiful variations is not going to be the goal, not always, when engaging with the field as a whole. Finally, some people argue whether developing a stable body of knowledge should even be a goal of HCI, and that in fact the goal might be to provide questioning and provocative and disruptive research. And then that raises the question of whether synthesis can do that. We think that synthesis can fulfill both of those roles, depending on how it is conducted. And we address all of these objections in more detail in the paper. Looking at systematic reviews specifically, this is often described as the gold standard, particularly so in evidence-based medicine. Yet the way that they are conducted is often very flawed, and many are actually described as misleading or not as useful as they could be in other fields, and HCI may be heading in this direction as well. HCI as a field hosts a broad range of different opinions and expectations when it comes to research synthesis and systematic reviews, starting with basic terminology and definitions. What is a systematic review in HCI? What is a meta-analysis? Do systematic reviews have a place in HCI, and is their output novel, or does that even matter? What are systematic reviews for? How should they be conducted, and what forms of knowledge can and should they produce? For our purposes, we see systematic reviews as distinct from other types of synthesis. For example, systematic review is not a description of previous work on a certain topic, like an annotated bibliography, and it should not be without information on how the results were constructed. We do not think a review is systematic if it is not conducted without an a priori plan. We do not think it is systematic just because the review has a Prisma figure attached. In this paper, we offer a definition of what we think could work as a definition for systematic, but we don't intend it to be prescriptive. More so, we want to start a conversation about when we should consider a review to be systematic in HCI as a field as a whole. Which steps do we require? So, for example, do we require pre-registration? Do we require assessment of quality as one of the steps? Do we expect certain methods or databases? As a field, do we have a stance on single versus double screening, on vote counting, on inter-rater reliability metrics? There is guidance and efforts at standardization do exist, but they are generally premised around the types of knowledge developed in other fields. For example, randomized controlled trials or RCTs, which we don't really have that many of in HCI. HCI, with its disciplinary diversity, or disciplinary anxiety depending on who you talk to, makes it quite difficult to find something that fits for synthesis. In the paper, we highlight several critical issues at various points in the ecosystem of research synthesis within HCI. Starting with primary research reporting. Given the sheer variety in how we report even similar and identical types of research in HCI, how can we compare and weigh and integrate findings in later synthesis? Then, in terms of the diverse epistemologies that exist within primary research, how can we synthesize findings from methods and epistemologies that differ so broadly? So, for example, to support mixed methods synthesis and to integrate knowledge developed through design research. In the synthesis itself and in the reporting of secondary research, what guidance actually works for our field? And do we need to develop guidance specific to HCI? For example, the Prisma doesn't actually fit very well. Most reviews referencing it don't actually apply it. In the publishing ecosystem, there also needs to be some changes. For example, which venues actually welcome reviews? AltCHI has no subcommittee that explicitly welcomes it. Tokai states that they rarely publish survey papers unless they offer a major original contribution, but there's no guidance on what major original contribution, what would qualify. CSIR does welcome reviews, but they do not provide guidance on what that should look like. And finally, in our technical infrastructure, our digital libraries are poorly documented and barely evaluated. Do we want or how can we support reproducible searches? How can we support comparable searches across databases? And which databases actually provide what kind of coverage for HCI? Finally, with the rapid growth in artificial intelligence and machine learning, to what extent can and should semi-automated or fully automated tools be reused actually in systematic reviews? So welcome to the Systematic Review-lution. If you are interested in this topic, please talk to us. Join us. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.